Caucasus in the 17th century. It was located, as I mentioned, in southeastern part of Poland and Galicia. When people ask me where you're from, my accent gives me away each time. I have to ponder for a minute. I was born in Poland. Then it became part of the Soviet Union. Then it was occupied by Nazi Germany. Again, reversed to Soviet Union. Today is the Ukraine. When my mother and grandmother were born, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was only one constant. For the Jews, no matter what empire, what dictator came along, each change of regime brought pogrom and persecution and misery to our people. Before World War II, the population in our town was some 12,000, out of which 40% were Jews, 40 Ukrainians, and some 10% of Poles. This was a rich agricultural area where grain and cattle were shipped throughout Poland and Western Europe. Our people were employed in every trade and profession. There were shoemakers and tanners and carpenters and traders, doctors and lawyers. My father was an accountant in a large flour mill. My mother was a teacher. I had a brother 2 years older, Yulik, whom I loved dearly and look up to. Both my father and my brother were fine flute players, and one of their hobbies was collecting stamps. We lived in a little house surrounded by a garden with part of our vegetables and fruits came from our garden. I attended Polish public school every morning and every afternoon for 2 hours Hebrew school. As a Sunday school teacher here in Atlanta, I used to tell my students that this was not a cruel and unusual punishment, that we children loved our school, whose poet Yitzhak Berger, beloved poet, was our principal. And to this day I marvel how these poorly paid teachers in our crowded classroom were able to instill in us children deep love of our heritage and our faith, a faith that will be so severely tried a few years hence. In 1939, I was 11 years old, totally unaware that we stood at the brink of an abyss. That summer, my mother, my grandmother, uncle, and cousins were vacationing in the Carpathian Mountains. I recall splashing in the cold mountain brook and feeling that the world was wonderful and full of promise. In the middle of August, a telegram arrived from my father urging us to return home immediately, that war was imminent. On the way to the railroad station, my mother found a grocery store that was open. And she bought whatever he had there, which wasn't very much, mostly cookies and candies. And so I thought to myself, well, if the war begins like that, it can't be terribly bad. And so I said, this was not her usual shopping list. I sat on the train and munched on my sweets and couldn't understand why the elders were so concerned. At each railroad station, we saw Polish troops moving west to the German border. What we did not know, that at the same time, German army trains were moving east, and on the trains were graffiti. We are off to Poland to thrash the Jews. Hundreds of miles from my little town of Hordenka, plans were set in order to destroy and annihilate everything we loved and cherished. When we got home, we learned that Germany declared issued an ultimatum to Poland. The country was mobilizing. My father was too old, my brother was too young. Both served in civil defense. September 1st, 1939, war broke out. Our town was bombed. There were a number of civilian casualties. And I'll never forget the sound of the whistle of the bombs as they descended upon us and we hid in a shelter. News from the front was getting worse day by day. Warsaw was bombed and many other large cities. On the third day of the war, we became very hopeful. We heard that France and England declared war on Germany, and surely we thought the war will not last for very long. We saw the Polish government fleeing to exile. We happened to live close to the Romanian border. And there was discussion at home that perhaps my father and my brother should flee. We heard the Jewish men were taken to forced labor. But surely everyone thought women and children would be saved. Not in our wildest nightmares could we have imagined what was to come. There were no prophets of old to warn us of the impending catastrophe. My parents were steeped in German culture. They spoke the language well. They loved its music and literature. They could not have imagined the barbarity that came from a quote-unquote civilized nation. As Stalin and Hitler pact took effect, Poland was once again divided, and the eastern part of Poland where I lived was occupied by the Soviet Union, the rest by Nazi Germany. After a few weeks, schools reopened. The children had to learn a new language, the Russian language, the Cyrillic alphabet, and a great deal of communist propaganda. We were told that we live in the best of all possible world under the leadership of the great Stalin. Yet the reality on the ground was quite different. As we heard the rumble of trucks in the night, people were exiled to Siberia. Political leaders, religious leaders, both Jews and Gentiles. Little did we know, though, that exile to that frozen wasteland of Siberia was much preferable to what awaited us all. On June 22nd, 1942, Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and we were at war again. On July 1941, Germans occupied our town, and the reign of terror began. They erected 8 gallows in the center of town, randomly selected 8 Jews and hung them. We were told we did not follow all their orders. That's what's going to happen to everyone. They thrashed the great synagogue you saw before in the picture. They burned the Torah scrolls and prayer books, dragged out the rabbi who lived nearby, beat him severely, and forced them to dance for them. Each day, new proclamations were issued, each one of them under the threat of death if not followed. And here are some of the proclamations. All Jewish men from the age of 14 to 60 must register for forced labor. All Jews must wear a white armband with the blue Star of David. And here the Nazis miscalculated somewhat. This indeed was a passport to death, but it was never a badge of shame for us. We love that symbol, and today it graces the flag of Israel, a free Jewish state in 2,000 years. Jewish children cannot attend school. I happen to live next door to my Polish public school, and as I saw my Christian classmates pass by, some with averted faces, I ran to my mother and asked, well, why can't I go to school? I was a pretty good student. I was a well-behaved kid. And I'll never forget the pain in her eyes she could not explain. Not only could her children not go to school, but she, as a teacher, could not do what she loved best, to teach. Jews cannot enter stores. Jews cannot socialize with Christians. Jewish doctors and lawyers cannot practice. All radios, gold, silver, furs, and valuable objects had to be turned over to the German authorities. This was the largest robbery and thievery perpetrated by a sitting government in broad daylight. My grandmother was an Orthodox lady. She refused to part with the Sabbath candlesticks. And so in the dark of night, as all the children and grandchildren stood around, they were buried in a garden, in the hope that one of us will survive and be able to retrieve him. The unrelenting terror, night and day, is difficult to describe. Those of you who have seen the picture Shoah of Schindler's List, anybody here, will get the idea what the deportations were like. But a constant terror is difficult to imagine. If you had the misfortune to run into a German on your city street, you had to take off your hat and get off the sidewalk, take off your hat and bow. If you came out alive from an encounter with pure chance, people were beaten, dogs were trained to attack them. It was only a few years ago that a man here in Georgia was extradited to Germany to stand trial. And his defense was that all he did was train dogs. Well, I saw what those dogs could do. One rolled over my mother's cousin. It was not a pretty picture. Sabbaths and the holidays were the worst of time. This is when most of the actions and most of the execution took place. In October 1941, a ghetto was established in our town. A few streets in the Jewish section of town were designated as the ghetto, and barbed wire was thrown across the street. My grandmother's house was in that part of town. We had to move there. And as a horse-drawn wagon came to pick up a few of our possessions, I picked up my little kitten to take her with me. And my mother said, "Put her down, we cannot take her in the ghetto." And I said, "Well, why not?" She said, "There won't be enough food in the ghetto." I was shocked. "What do you mean, not enough food for a tiny little cat?" Well, it didn't take long to realize how right she was. The rations the Nazis allowed were extremely small, and hunger and starvation raged the ghetto. My mother tried to normalize our life as much as she could. She organized classes for me and my friends, and so we sat in the back room of the house and studied literature and poetry and math and science. Years later, I wondered, why didn't she teach us how to make Molotov cocktails? Not that she didn't know. And then I realized how wise she was. She wanted us to believe that there was a future for us. She wanted us to believe that scholarship mattered. Yet one by one, my little friend disappeared. A silly euphemism, they were murdered. As winter approached, the hunger in the ghetto increased. You began to see children with swollen stomachs begging in the streets. My father still worked in a mill for the Germans because they couldn't find a substitute for him, so we had some flour. And my grandmother opened a soup kitchen. The lines were getting longer day by day. The soup was getting thinner. Rumors were flying that the Sonderkommandos, the death squads, were approaching our region, and they were coming our way. Christopher Browning, in his book Ordinary Men, describes this group of mass killers, the Reserve Battalion 101 of the German Order Police. These people were recruited in Hamburg, Germany. They came from every walk of life. They were teachers and postmen and dog workers, and they were brought to our region. Within a few short weeks, they became what Daniel Goldhagen called Hitler's willing executioners. Commander Doppler came to the Judenrat, the Jewish Community Center, and he told us that if we give him 5 kilograms of gold and other precious jewels, that he will make sure that our city will be spared. Yet our city was not spared. On Friday, December 4, 1941, an order was issued that all Jews must assemble in front of the great synagogue to be inoculated against typhus. Some people, like my father, were skeptical. Why would the Nazis suddenly worry about our health? He hid us in the attic of the mill where he worked. Yet the following day, as many people assembled in front of the synagogue, suddenly they were herded into the synagogue. They were kept there for 2 days, 2 nights, without food and water, and then taken away by trucks. As we sat shivering in that mill, when the shooting and the screaming stops, we made our way back to the ghetto. We came to the grandmother's house. The whole family was assembled there. My 3 cousins were crying. My uncle was desolate. My beautiful, tall, redhead Almija was taken away. My grandmother, who was an ailing and elderly lady, was though a pillar of strength for us for that period. She tried to reassure us, and she told us that we will try to find out where these people were taken. We will get warm clothes, send warm clothes to my aunt, and send her food. We went to sleep somewhat reassured, only to wake up the next day and find out about the catastrophe that befell our people. 2,500 men, women, and children were taken by truck to nearby forts of Shemakhovtse. There they were forced to disrobe in the barn and approach the ravine in a group of 5 with their machine gun. The music was playing to muffle the sounds of the shots. Our people were murdered in cold blood. The following day, Commander Doppler came to the Judenrat, the Jewish community, and he demanded 2,500 marks for the bullets spent killing the Jews. The clothes they collected, the best, were sent to Germany. The rest were sold on the city streets. Public mourning was forbidden. Any Jew who was unshaved, it is our custom of Shiva, of 7 days of mourning, was severely beaten or shot. Commander Doppler came to the Jewish community, and he told us that if the people work very hard and provide him with whatever it is he demands, that no more killings would occur. Deception and lies were the order of the day. The noose was being pulled tighter. We felt trapped and abandoned, and the world was silent. What we did not know, that on January 20, 1942, the top officials, Nazi officials, sat around the table in Wannsee, in a suburb of Berlin, and there planned the final solution, the annihilation of all of the Jews. These were not some creatures from a distant planet. These were barbarians with PhDs. Some young people fled across the border to Romania. Some tried to flee on false papers. Sadly, many were found out by some Polish neighbors for a pound of sugar. They denounced their neighbors. Mm-hmm. Many in the woods and joined the partisans. Everyone built a hiding place, a bunker, and so did my father. It was a room in the attic, disguised by a bookshelf. Not like the one I saw a few years back in Amsterdam, where the family of Anne Frank was hidden. I remember being carried on my father's arm, half asleep before dawn, into this hiding place. If the sun rose and the Gestapo did not arrive, another day in the ghetto began. On Passover 12, 1942, the second akcja, the second roundups occurred in our town. Again, the screams, Juden raus, Jews out, were heard throughout. Once again, our father hid us in the attic in a flour mill. Those people who were caught were brought to the railroad station and loaded into cattle cars. I remember being awakened at dawn in the mill where we were hiding by the most plaintive whistle of a locomotive. I didn't know that on a train bound for Belzec was my dearest childhood friend, Genya Rice. And by the way, Belzec was not like Auschwitz, where you went to the right to work or to the left to the crematorium. In Belzec, within 24 hours, all of the people were killed. Genya and I used to save every penny to see another Shirley Temple movie. You still remember who she was? We wore Shirley Temple rings. We played with Shirley Temple cutout dolls. She always dreamed that someday she would be a great singer in America, no less. I could never top that one. Genya was 12 years old. We assembled at my grandmother's house and counted our losses. On the train bound for Belzec was my Uncle Max, my Uncle Nathan, his son Max, 13, and cousin Lisha, 19. I'll never forget the battered face of my cousin. He jumped out of the cattle car and returned to town. Sadly, he couldn't run fast enough or far enough. He never survived the show. The third act, by the way, I prefer to use the word Shoah rather than the Holocaust. Holocaust comes from the Greek word meaning a burnt offering, the kind that were brought to Jerusalem in the days of old. And Torah refers to them as Reach Nichoach Ladonai, a pleasing odor unto the Lord. The smokestack of Auschwitz were not a pleasing odor to man or God. The word Shoah means destruction, terror. It is truly described that awful period. The third akta took place September 1942. The old and the sick, some were shot in the Jewish cemetery. The rest were loaded into cattle cars on the way to the death camp of Belzec. Our town was declared Judenfrei, free of Jews. Anybody found 24 hours after 24 hours would be shot outside. And so it is today, as I saw not many years ago when I returned to my hometown of Hordenka. Our family met for the last time at my grandmother's house. And the family decided that the most merciful thing to do was to give my grandmother a lethal injection and bury her with honor. And so as we all sat in the living room, tears running down our faces, we loved our Babcha very much. My uncle, Jacob, who was a chemist, was to go to her bedroom and try to do it. Within a few minutes, the door opened and he came out, sobbing bitterly and apologizing. He just could not do it. Even then, he could not become a mercy killer. He did something very special for all of us. He gave each one of us, including the children, a poison pill. And we had to promise that we only use it in the worst of circumstances. And so my old and ailing grandmother and other people were put on a horse-drawn wagon to the next ghetto of Horodinka. The rest of them had to run as the SS and the Ukrainian police on horseback beat them and forced them to ride faster. Only a handful of Jews were allowed to remain in town. 60 of them, my father was one of them, those they needed to work for the Germans. My mother, my brother, and I found ourselves in the ghetto of Tosia. That fall, by the way, the German Gestapo came to the mill where he worked and wanted to take him away. His boss, Mr. Miller, said he needed him to work there, and he said he'll wait 24 hours when he gets the books in order. And then he was taken away. To this day. I'm not sure the last days of his life. My mother and my brother found ourselves in the ghetto of Tosia. If there ever was a hellhole on earth, this certainly was it. Thousands of people and few narrow streets in the Jewish section of town were brought there. That winter, my mother made the last attempt to save my life. She met a man who was willing to take me, to get for me false papers and take me to a remote village to a friend of his and tell him that I am his cousin. And so for the next 2 days, she taught me how to behave in church. She taught me about catechism. As a teacher in Polish public school, she was there when the priest came to instruct the children. And so she was familiar with customs of the church. Every time my resolve waned, she kept repeating over and over again, someone must survive to tell the world. Someone must survive. And today it is the title of my memoir in English. And a couple of years ago it was published in France as well. The evening of the second day came. I said goodbye to my brother and walked with her to the edge of the ghetto. It was a bitter winter day. Children with swollen stomachs were huddling in the doorways. People were begging for food. I tried to imprint all these sights to remember them. And then, as I stood and embraced my mother and said goodbye, I realized more than ever that I will never see her again. And why would I want to live where our people were murdered so brutally? Why would I want to live a life of a lie? And I told her I'm not going. And to this day, I'm very grateful she did not force me or urge me to do it. She realized even though I was only 14 years old, the decision had to be mine. And so I had a few more precious weeks with her and my brother. That winter, she contacted typhus, and at the age of 39, she died of starvation and disease. I really don't remember very much of that winter. I had typhus as well, high fever and delirium for many weeks. In spring, as I recovered, my brother and I were taken to labor camp of Lisovce in the summer of 1943. We worked in the fields. The work was different. I tried to pass for 18, even though I was just 14 years old. But in an open field, we could always find something edible, and we did not starve as badly as we did in the ghetto. On July 21, 1943, we were working around the clock at the threshing machine. My brother Yunus was working the night shift, and I was resting near the haystack with a woman who was hiding 2 children with her. Children were strictly forbidden in the labor camp. Suddenly, before dawn, Shots were heard all around. One shot hit the little girl in the foot. She was whimpering and bleeding profusely. We were asked to assemble, to go to the assembly point. When we got there were a number of people already there, and the men were ordered, the shooting continued. Men were ordered to dig graves. And I recall well what I saw that morning. I saw the our sages and rabbis arrive, and there is an olam haba, a world beyond, that all will be well. I will be with my family and my friends, and my little shtetl, my little town. And there's only this world of hell to be done with. It will be okay as well. I just hope that they shoot straight. Suddenly, the commander of our camp, Mr. Frank, arrived on a horseback and screamed at the Gestapo that he needed us to complete the harvest, that they can come after the harvest and kill us all. The Gestapo left, and we proceeded to collect our fallen comrades, and among them was my brother Yulek, 17. The days that followed were in the haze. I did not go to work and walked aimlessly through the compound. Suddenly I saw the black boots in front of me, our commander, and I was sure that the end I longed for had come. Yet he asked me how old I was and told me to go to his villa, to his house, and tell the cook to give me food and clean clothes. I didn't realize then, but a little later, that Mr. Frank was a pretty decent man and really tried to help us. And so that summer, I worked in the attic of his house, knitting sweaters that he sent back to Germany. I met there a girl my age, Fritschka, who was also left all alone. And just being with her, being able to talk to someone my age, renewed my will to go on. The news of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising filled us with spirits. We wished we could have been there. During the winter of 1943, we worked outdoors without gloves or stockings and wooden shoes. In the bitter winter, Polish winters with sub-zero temperatures were quite often. Fritschka and I slept in the same bunk. We shared every scrap of food we can find. One morning I was getting ready to work. I realized she was burning up. I did not need a medical diagnosis to know that she had typhus. I went outside and got some snow to cool her forehead and went to work. Around noontime, shots were heard in the compound, and I knew that Fritschka was no more. A friend told me that he was told to help her get down the bunk and put her shoes on. And she looked at him and said, "Where I'm going, I don't need any shoes." And with her head held high, she walked outside the barracks where she was shot. Only a dirty brown stain remained in the snow when I returned. And Fritschka was no more. She was 15 years old. The Gestapo periodically swept through our camp and killed the weak and the sick. The news of German defeat at Stalingrad renewed our will to go on yet another day to see that evil empire destroyed. On March 44, quite unexpectedly, Russian troops liberated our camp. Before we had a chance to take one breath of free air, 8 German Stuka planes flew over the camp and threw incendiary bombs. Those who tried to flee were machine gunned from the air. The Nazis did not want any eyewitness to the terror and brutality they perpetrated. One of the severely wounded was a young woman we called the Nightingale. I tried to reassure her and tell her we'll take her to the Russian field hospital. We'll try to get help for her. By all she said, hold my hand a little longer, for me it is too late. And indeed, her beautiful voice was still forever. V-Day, Victory Day did not bring much rejoicing. Surely we were glad that the carnage had stopped. Yet only then did we begin to realize our losses. I am the only survivor of 14 members of my immediate family and many, many more distant relatives. We began to realize too the tragedy that befell our people. A third of world Jewry was murdered. Great institutions of learning, scholars, poets were no more. The survivors had to live one of the most painful accusations made by ignorant people. They walked like sheep to slaughter. No one ever accused the over 500,000 Russian prisoners of war killed by the Germans of cowardice, or the 20,000 Polish officers killed in the Katyn forest by the Soviets of cowardice, of lack of resistance. Yet somehow the world expected resistance from the defenseless civilian population. And resist they did. Teaching Jewish children under the threat of death, as my mother did, was resistance. Refusing to give up her Sabbath candlesticks, as my grandmother did, was resistance. The first civilian uprising in any Nazi-occupied territory occurred in the Warsaw Ghetto. Let us remember that the starved and isolated, poorly armed members of the Jewish Defense Organization fought valiantly, knowing full well that survival or victory were impossible. They fought to die with dignity. They held out longer than the whole country of Poland, with a standing army, navy, and world support. They held out longer than the Maginot Line in France. There was resistance in death camps. As you heard before, 2 crematoria were blown out in Auschwitz. There was resistance in Sobibor and Treblinka. Our partisans fought in forests and fields. Jews joined resistance fighters in every occupied country in Europe, in France, Belgium, Italy, Yugoslavia. They fought in the Jewish Brigade of the British Army. For the survivors, lay a long, difficult road ahead to find a place in the world and to learn to live a normal life again. It is a cautionary tale we cannot fail to learn from, or humankind is bound for the future. Our people endured persecution and suffering throughout our own history, but never in the history of humanity was the total annihilation of a people planned and executed with such ruthlessness. The Nazis did not want our land, we had none. They did not want just our possessions, although they plundered and robbed in an unprecedented manner. They did not want us to convert to any particular religion and join any party. They simply set out to dehumanize, to degrade, and murder every Jewish man and child, and they nearly succeeded. We must understand that hatred, bigotry, and anti-Semitism lead to the gates of Auschwitz. Abraham Volksmann, the chairman of the Anti-Defamation League, said recently. He wrote that the gas chambers in crematoria did not begin with bricks. They began with words. We must not allow the revisionists of history and the deniers of the Shoah triumph. To listen to a witness is to become a witness, wrote the Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel. As our days are dwindling, we leave our stories in your hands. Preserve them and pass them on to your family and friends. Pass on the torch of remembrance. Thank you.
Thank you. This is so painful to hear. And you have to think of the years of pain. Are there questions that anyone is brave enough to ask? Yes, ma'am.
The candlesticks that you spoke of, did you ever retrieve them, or were they ever
It's
discovered?
interesting, whenever I speak to students in school, that's the first question they ask. Sadly, so far not yet. In 1997, when we visited my hometown, this was shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Every few miles we passed, there were roadblocks. We never knew that there was a police or the SOCs on one and the same. They would have killed us had we tried. But I'm still hoping that perhaps one day my children or grandchildren were able to do it. If it happens, it will be the greatest possession I ever could have. I have nothing from home, absolutely nothing.
Yes.
Was the campaign against the Jews overnight, or did it, was it a progressive thing?
Oh, it was practically overnight. I mean, they came in, as I mentioned, they struck the synagogue, they started grabbing people to forced labor. And then by the first action occurred within a few minutes, first the ghetto and then the destruction. It was very fast. And we felt totally isolated and helpless.
Thank you.
Yes, Mark.
What was the word that you used to rename the Holocaust?
Shoah.
Shoah.
S-H-O-A-H.
I feel it's much more appropriate than Holocaust, even so it's internationally known and there are Holocaust observers that should be, but people should realize that Shoah is really more appropriate for that period of history.
Yes. Yes.
How old were you when you came to the States, and where did you come to? Did you come to Atlanta, or did you come to?
No, I came to Peekskill, New York. I had a cousin there, and she signed the papers for me that I will not be a burden on the state, as we all have to do, and I came there. But I would like to tell you my first day in America. I came down to breakfast, this American breakfast I've never seen, you know, with bananas and cereals and whatnot. My cousin and I spoke Polish still at the time, and suddenly I'm getting more and more upset. The radio is going full speed, and I'm getting more and more upset. And finally I asked her, what's going on? I'm the first day in America, and all I hear is Jews and Jews and Jews. What do they want from the Jews? And she started laughing and crying. It was advertising for oranges. Studying Chaucer and Shakespeare in Germany in high school did not prepare me for Yankee English. I had to rely on it.
And how old were you? I'm sorry.
When I came to this country, I was 19.
Yes,
What happened to you from liberation to coming to this country?
Oh, it was a slow, painful trip. When I first went to my hometown and found out that nobody survived, and I was told it's unsafe to stay overnight, and the locals did not like to see us return. They'd taken over our homes and our possessions, and it was very dangerous. So I made our way across the border towards Romania before the war, and to look for food. We were starving. We only felt safe to go to a Russian field kitchen, and they gave us some soup to eat. And somebody said across the border in Romania there's food, and so we made our way as people. And I remember being totally exhausted, falling asleep, getting up in the morning and looking in the window, and I saw I died and went to heaven. I couldn't believe it. They were only 40 miles away from the Romanian border. Streetcars were running, women in high heels and lipstick. It was like nothing had happened. While total mayhem was for us. So we went downstairs, there were 4 or 5 of us, and to describe what I looked like, wooden shoes, clothes we wore and slept and worked in for the last two years. No facilities to wash or anything like that. some people who had Jewish people who had relatives across the border in Poland surrounded us and wanted to know if we heard about their family. Of course, we didn't bring any good news. But then a gentleman came over and said he was a cousin of my mother's, and he took me home with him. His wife, my aunt, took one look at me, burned all my clothes. And I remember second day standing in the bathroom and first decent shower and being shocked. I did not recognize myself. I didn't see a mirror for years, and I had remembered the face of a child, which I was not anymore.
Wow.
So it took a long time to learn a normal life again. Even so, the Soviets liberated us, so we had no desire to live under the communist regime. So we made our way to Poland. There was an exchange of population. And there, sadly, we found out in Poland the Jews were not very welcome either. The one thing we heard too many times, that one good thing Hitler did was get rid of the Jews. There was a pogrom. There was a killing of over 42 Jews in Kielce in 1946.
Wow.
It's just really unbelievable. Again, we didn't want to remain in Poland. At that time, I really wanted to go to Palestine, but all doors were shut. The British had the white paper, and we could not enter. They sent people to Cyprus.
Wow.
So we made our way to the American zone in Germany, and I lived in Fürth in Nuremberg. Attended Mädchenoberschule in Fürth, German school. I was the only Jewish kid, which was quite an experience. But what was more important, Nuremberg trials were taking place there. And I went to one of the sessions.
Wow.
And so near Bern, as close as your city, it was quite an experience.
Wow.
We looked at these people, they were impressed, khakis, and they looked clean, not the way they kept us as prisoners. It was quite an experience to see that. Of course, justice was not exactly done. The great majority of the Nazis and killers went scot-free, but that's a different story.
Jermaine.
Yeah, Teresa, what was the name of the person who was coming in and out of the ghetto to do the bartering and then going back out to take food to their family? Was there a group of people, or was there like just a few that you knew about?
Well, the ghetto mostly was pretty well closed, tightly closed, but there were always ways of escaping. So people were starving. Especially they would try to get it from the worst, to get small children to get their way out, to get a potato, get a piece of bread, and so forth. There was no specifically group of people. It's just people doing what they could to survive.
So they had I thought maybe it was like a passage out, because in that movie I was telling you about, but Hidden in Silence, and they were showing how they were getting out and they were distracting the German soldiers to get out and do the bartering and hide the family members in the
That occurred
hospital.
too. Yeah, but sadly, so many were caught and tortured and murdered. It was not easy. Yes.
Questions? Yes.
Over here,
Okay, yes.
I guess with such atrocities and loss that you've had to endure, how have you been over time able to work towards forgiveness?
Forgiveness of what? The Germans? Is that what you're asking?
How you have
Never.
How have you?
Not the Germans as a whole, but those who were perpetrators. Absolutely not. They never stood trial. They never paid for the horror that they committed. You know, there is no forgiveness. Not here and not out there either for what they have done. In my town, they went to the orphanage and they were throwing Jewish babies into the trucks or slashing their little heads against the wall. No, there's no forgiveness for just such atrocity.
The Bible says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And we all know that in all of our lives, there's going to be vengeance that we're not going to be able to deal with, but it will be God, either in this world or, like you said, olam haba, in the world to come. There's some things we have to just say, vengeance is mine. Yes, sir.
That was my question. Where did you see God in all of this? And was there any feeling of abandonment that he had just
Complete feeling of
faced down to
abandonment.
people?
Complete feeling of abandonment. I grew up and, as I mentioned, I was going to Hebrew school every afternoon, very steeped in the Bible and so forth. And there was no mercy, no. God wasn't there. We were alone. We were abandoned. That was the feeling. Of course, as years passed, I struggle with it. I still do, but I understand it differently.
Yes, John.
What about blocking out memories?
Blocking out?
And then maybe trying to recall them later on. I'm always kind of fascinated by
No,
that.
never for a minute. Somebody asked me, by the way, when the book came out, how do you remember it all? And all I could say, how could you forget? Because it's so embedded in my memory. It's just, and one of the things that, the thing I do this and write is the idea that those who knew that they cannot make it, tell our stories, don't forget us. The world must know what had happened. The world, and that is very important. So no, I don't want to block anything.
Thank God for your memory.
I just need the DVD.
Thank you very much for allowing me to
I wish I could be
videotape.
close.
It helps.
Yes,
See
yes.
it, that's fine.
I was really blessed by your testimony, and I thank you very much for sharing it, with us. We really most definitely need to hear this testimony, so we won't repeat that again.
That's the whole idea.
Yes, ma'am.
To learn from history, if we are about not to repeat.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much, and God bless you. Okay, appreciate it.